With me now, Ambassador Michael McFaul, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, now an NBC News international affairs analyst. So the story is now what's interesting about Gordon Sondland's decision is that all he does now is essentially back up Bill Taylor's testimony, back up the testimony of others. It reinforces the narrative that we thought was out there, and now the White House is missing a key important talking point, which is Ukraine never knew. Clearly, Ukraine knew.
That's right. And I think I agree completely that that's what this is. Now, two of the three amigos, I would say. I would also add Mr. Volker, Ambassador Volker's testimony that we've seen. Clearly, they don't like going along with this quote unquote drug deal, as the NSC advisor John Bolton called it. But they're doing it because they think it advances U.S.-Ukrainian relations. But it's clear as day there was a quid pro quo. I also want to keep reminding everyone, Chuck, however, even if there wasn't the holdup of military assistance, the ask to help the president in his re-election efforts in and of itself is also using the public office for private gain. So remember that. I know it adds even more to it that they held up this military assistance, but that is also true.
You know, Mike, one of the other talking points I hear is, well, he didn't do anything illegal. And my response always is that, well, I think there were some things we didn't think we had to pass a law for because there was only one person you'd be passing the law to deal with, one entity. But what would you say to that? Because I can tell you that is the new Republican elected talking point, whether it's Lindsey Graham, Tom Cole, whoever. They've all said, well, I don't know if he's technically committed a crime. How would you answer that?
Well, I'm also not a lawyer. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I did work at the White House. I worked in the State Department. And one of the first days on the job at the White House, maybe it was the first day, was I was read into what's called the Hatch Act. And we were told by our legal advisors that you cannot use your public office. You can't even use your NSC email to do anything that has to do with elections. And you had to be very careful about that. By the way, Chuck, I have the same rules here at Stanford. I can't use my Stanford email to go out and help a candidate for an election. So maybe the Hatch Act doesn't apply to the President of the United States. I don't know that. But most certainly it is wrong, and most certainly it is something that every U.S. government official knows is wrong.
Right. No, but I do believe it's not. I mean, that's been part of the issue of the executive branch, is that it applies to everybody but the two elected officials at the top, right? All of these, the compliance that cabinet officials have to do, the president and the vice president don't. Now, the president can sign an executive order saying it applies to them, but that's a whole nother story.
Different.
Let me ask you this. Who else would know, when you're now doing this, you've got Sondland knowing this, we're in this sort of two tracks of Ukrainian diplomacy. If you were telling House Democrats, where else would you want to go that you haven't heard from? Who else would you want to hear from that we haven't had a chance to hear from, that we might actually hear from, that might be willing to testify?
Oh, you just added a separate clause there, because, of course, I want to hear from the vice president, and I really want to hear from Secretary Pompeo.
I don't think we will hear from either, but...
Well, but hopefully the press will keep pressing him. Hopefully we'll keep getting to this. I just find it... He seems like I don't know Secretary Pompeo personally, but I have friends who do. He's a smart man. He knows that there's no server that's been stolen away. And then when he says things and he keeps, he implies that he was in on this deal, I would like him to, fess up one way or the other. Which side of this are you on? Was this wrong, but not impeachable? Well, if he said that, that would be an advance on the story in and of itself.
And on Rudy Giuliani, he seems to be the one in the most legal jeopardy. He's the one that there may be plenty of laws they can find that he broke, even whether it's the lobbying laws about not filing, if he ended up acting like a foreign lobbyist in a way that he wasn't. But what would you be pursuing with Giuliani? What laws do you believe, outside of the lobbying laws that they could get him on, what else could he have broken?
First, I just want to keep underscoring how crazy and kooky this is. Just reading Ambassador Sondland's testimony, he says right in there, we think the State Department should be in charge of U.S.-Ukrainian relations, not the private lawyer of the President of the United States. It's crazy. The lawyer's supposed to be defending the President. Why is he involved in U.S.-Ukrainian relations? By the way, even the State Department shouldn't be involved in investigating corruption in Ukraine. That's the job of the Department of Justice. We have people that do that. But what for me is most interesting in terms of the future is I'm not quite convinced that Mr. Giuliani and his two sidekicks were just interested in fighting corruption. I'm interested in what were their material things that they were pursuing. There's been some innuendo. There's been some hints at that. I want to know why Giuliani was being paid by his lieutenants to do this kind of work. I suspect there is a material financial gain that they were seeking to achieve. That's what I would like to know next.
And apparently one of them has decided they would like to perhaps cooperate a little bit more with the federal government. I think that was Mr. Parnas, and if that happens,
not good news for Mr. Giuliani.
Who knows? Then again, I've said if you started a company called Fraud Guarantee, I don't know, as Ms. Parnas did, I don't know if you're ever going to be credible. I don't care which side you're on. The company you started was Fraud Guarantee. Anyway, Ambassador McFaul, as always, sir, thank you very much. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.